to the McGill Philosophy Department Podcast. My name's Alex Carty, and I'm a PhD candidate here at McGill. And today I'm interviewing my friend, Radheesh Ameresekere.
Nice, man. Hey, how are you, Ard?
Good, thanks. So I'm interested in hearing about how you got into philosophy and how you basically came from like the undergraduate status into working in the PhD program at McGill.
Yeah, cool. I think what got me into philosophy was actually that I was interested in going to law school. And the advice I got from just about everybody is if you want to go to law school, take a couple philosophy courses because it's a wonderful way to prepare for all the things lawyers need to be able to do, reason logically, think through problems, communicate clearly. And I just really ended up enjoying it kind of for its own sake more. I found that all of the questions I was kind of interested in engaging with in law were articulated so much more clearly and thought about so much more seriously among philosophers. So I just ended up kind of sticking with it. I dropped all the other majors I had in undergrad. I thought about history and politics and criminology and a bunch of other things for a while. And I just ended up liking philosophy so much more. And that snowball kept rolling over the years. And I realized there probably wasn't anything I actually wanted to do quite as much as doing philosophy. So grad school in philosophy, doing a PhD felt very natural. It felt like the most realistic way to pursue those interests. And then I ended up here at McGill, and I do philosophy for a living now, which is pretty great.
Right. And so before McGill, you were at University of Toronto, and you were doing a BA there. And so most of the interest was in philosophy of law or like law per se. And then you got more interested in philosophy and stuff having to do with ethics and morality.
Yeah, no, I was always really kind of interested in practical philosophy more generally. That kind of came to me naturally. I think it came with the territory because you're right that like thinking about the philosophy of law was kind of, tangentially related also to thinking about political philosophy and ethics and just normative questions in general. But like in undergrad, I was at U of T. I had some weird interests and I had some weird stages. I was always really moved by like the philosophy of religion. Questions in that were personally relevant and personally interesting to me, even though I didn't see them quite as something I'd want to pursue in a sort of more professional setting. I had my sort of philosophy of mind, metaphysics stage, and I realized I might not be quite bright enough to be doing that full time. So I settled on ethics, political philosophy, and legal philosophy. And I've kind of carried that with me throughout. Actually, that's still what I work on here. I used to have a more historical lean in my thinking because I think that's just how things are done over at U of T. I did work in Kant and stuff like that and looked at like the sort of historical basis for political and legal thought. I'm much more contemporary these days, so not really working in the same kind of space. But yeah, that was kind of what I was doing my BA and all over the place. I think I took just about every philosophy course the BA at U of T had to offer. So I covered my bases before I got here.
Yeah, that's some good preparation before starting grad school. I'm interested to hear about this move from issues in legal like legality and philosophy of religion, and then you getting moved to working on political philosophy and stuff having to do with ethics.
Yeah.
What kind of stuff have you been working on recently that is pertaining to your like grad studies interests? Because it's a big shift, obviously, from going, at the undergraduate level, you're just writing smaller kind of papers. And so I'd like to hear about, what kind of stuff you've been working on now and what you have working on for your dissertation.
Great. Yeah. I'm happy to answer that, but I do want to circle back a little bit to the origins of some of those interests because they are, in fact, funnily enough, connected to some of the stuff that started to interest me in my undergrad. At U of T, I worked quite closely with Arthur Ripstein and Tom Herka, who are two exceptionally gifted political philosophers. And in certain ways, they really kind of influenced the projects I'm still working on now. But of course, there's also some significant deviations. But anyway, that's the context. I would say these days I'm working quite squarely on questions about justice. That's a huge field in political and legal philosophy. I'm particularly interested in questions of international distributive justice. The basic question there is how, if at all, should we be regulating the distribution of essential goods on a global scale? And that's a really tough question because our intuitions about justice, which are sometimes articulated as the fact that, just about everyone kind of deserves a fair share in things like healthcare or income or safety or these basic goods we think we have strong moral reasons to give everyone a little bit of. that comes into tension with a long-standing commitment in international relations to sovereignty. We don't really have like this unified global order. We have like toothless institutions like the UN and international criminal courts, but we don't have the basic structure of society sort of ported to the basic global structure that we would need in order to give distributive principles a real institutional form. Or at least I think this is sort of my qualm with the way the debate is set up. So my goal, I think, in a lot of the work I do is to ease that tension a little bit, maybe to show that justice and sovereignty are not deeply in tension. You still have to work it out and you have to comb through the knots, but these are not things that are mutually exclusive or cannot exist. So I think I have quite a lot of faith that the world could be a fairer place, but that hope is somewhat constrained by like just the way history has set up the international community.
Yeah, and I'm interested in hearing about if there are like examples or specific issues having to do with international justice that you find yourself gravitated towards, because I know that I've taught, for example, stuff having to do with like just like international justice with respect to climate change, how we distribute or figure out who has a say in the remaining carbon budget or something like that. Another issue could be having to do with healthcare, just like international issues with respect to, the procurement of vaccines or something like that during COVID. So I would like to hear a bit more about if there's, if it's justice in the abstract at the international level that you're interested in, or if any of these specific issues might eventually take interest or have a home in the project.
Yeah, wonderful. That's always a thoughtful question. And I guess this is sort of tacitly helpful for me to think about what my dissertation should be doing. I think I do tend to lean a bit abstract, but I think a wonderful goal would be to bridge ideal and non-ideal theory. And to answer the question a little bit more precisely, one of the theaters of international justice that really interests me is the distribution of healthcare. Right. That's something that's always interested me in general, the distribution of healthcare, but it's particularly interesting in an international context. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, infectious disease spread is very globalized these days. We live in an increasingly connected world. So it's kind of difficult actually to think about like, okay, how do we curve infection rates or how do we end pandemics and endemics without thinking about, all right, where are the lines globally for what states owe one another? The second thing that I really have become interested in is the fact that healthcare is a good that belongs to the market. In fact, like it's not exactly the same as something like security. It's not exactly the same as something like you hear like people talk about capacity as like in Nussbaum and Amartya Sen. Healthcare these days is determined by market forces. Vaccines, for example, as like a very clear tool for curving, international infection rates. They're patent protected. These are products that are sold. There's a cost to them. And so that complicates the picture. But in my mind, that actually also really moves us in the right direction when it comes to governance, because I articulated a few moments ago that my skepticism follows from the fact that we don't really have a system of international governance. But my hunch is that, in fact, if there is a system that is governing the way things go, it's the market de facto. The market is a system of governance. It's irresistible. It has norms. It should have norms. There should be rules. There are players. There are stakes. It is quite similar, actually, to the way traditional institutions function. So, yeah, health has kind of been an interesting space for me to practically work out some of those abstract things. Like, that's what gave rise to the thoughts about markets and stuff. And I've also been thinking about health for a long time from a research perspective. It's something that's always interested me. It's a real stress test of our intuitions, actually. All the traditional problems political philosophers tend to think about, really express themselves quite nicely in the context and domain of health. So that is maybe one of the more concrete places I've become interested in. And it would be wonderful if the dissertation is able to take a theory and then levy it in defense of something like the compulsory licensing of vaccines or broad like public health programs or international like wealth efforts to ameliorate the costs associated in low and middle income countries. So yeah, that's the practical side of what I do.
Yeah. And so I understand too that you've published some stuff, or at least some stuff is out there that's not necessarily having to do with your dissertation research, but it's still broadly related to, stuff having to do with healthcare and more like public facing type of projects. And so I'd like to just hear a bit more about what's going on with that. And successes and stuff that that you've just experienced when you're writing these kind of public-facing pieces that still deal with issues that you're interested in, with like international justice and so on.
Yeah, wonderful. No, the kind of interest in international justice sprung up after I felt I had sort of exhausted my interest in domestic justice.
Mm-hmm.
One of the papers that I put out actually this year was, it was more of a research article than like a traditionally public-facing piece of work, but it was also just a defense of a particular distribution of healthcare. One of the long-standing arguments from the liberal camp that I tend to align with is the very smart and very intuitively correct idea that healthcare is special in a way that should be distributed equally. And the best way to explain that is by appealing to some higher principle of justice. And the intuitive one to go to is opportunity. Healthcare protects one's ability to pursue the normal range of things they want to do. If you're a basketball player, getting healthcare to fix up a broken leg preserves your opportunity. If you want to teach and you can't do so when you're sick, healthcare will restore that. And because most theories of justice think that public citizens are entitled to some share in opportunity equally, that you can subsume healthcare under that kind of distributive principle. My work was something of a critique of that. I think that gets at the right idea, but I think opportunity is the wrong principle for a couple of reasons. The two arguments I tried to levy is that, first of all, not all healthcare can protect opportunity. Things like care for terminal illness don't do that. Actually, in fairness, these are cases that don't even aim to protect it, actually. Right. You're not really trying to restore opportunity for somebody. You're kind of trying to actually help them cope with the end of their opportunities.
I see. Yeah.
And there are also, to be more precise and clarify what I meant earlier, there are just types of healthcare that can't do that. For example, say somebody has something like ALS, which is a miserable, awful disease. No amount of healthcare in the world is going to restore their normal functioning. You just cannot reverse the degradation of nerve cells in someone's spine if they have ALS. What you can do is help them manage that. You can help them cope, and you can kind of give them the care that disability supports usually tend to do. But those are not subsumable under opportunity. So you end up with a distribution that kind of tacitly discriminates against people with disabilities and chronic illnesses.
Right.
You get a case where you have to say, if these people have a claim to healthcare, the source of that claim is not justice, it's something different. So I got to thinking about what sort of principle might work. The opportunity stuff is rooted in a lot of Rawls, and I thought Rawls might be a fun place to see, maybe there's another principle. And for me, the principle that made the most sense was something like Rawls's principle of distributing self-respect, or the basis of self-respect. My intuition was just that healthcare is actually a base of self-respect, even when it can't protect someone's opportunity. Rawls thinks of self-respect kind of intuitively. It's just a sense that your life is worth living, that your peers don't think your life is useless, and that you kind of have confidence to undertake it. I think something like ALS care does promote self-respect that way. It gives a person a sense that I can ride this out. I'm going to have the supports I need. My life is not completely worthless. My peers recognize my needs should be met.
Right.
So I think it can be subsumed under that kind of principle. And that was the argument.
Yeah. So the main, the original view was that, if I understand it correctly, like other people are saying, the opportunities are like necessary for the kind of justification of the procurement of the healthcare.
Yeah.
And you come in and say, well, no, they might be sufficient, but they're not necessary.
Yeah.
And what's also sufficient is the Rawlsian conception of self-respect.
Good. Yeah.
And when you see that you don't necessarily need the opportunities there for the reasons that you mentioned. Is that broadly what's going on there?
I would say so. The thinking was to basically show, and to get a little bit granular about it, the goal was to show that there are basically three types of healthcare. Healthcare that protects a person's normal function. This is usually covered under the opportunity view. Healthcare that sometimes actually enhances a person's function. Think of like genetic editing or plastic surgery. This is usually well covered by like the utilitarians and consequentialist theories. So that's two types. The type I was trying to emphasize is that there's also just a broad range of healthcare that aims to manage like substandard function. Like when things fail and they can't be restored, you still need healthcare.
Right.
And I think my view actually covers all three. The opportunity view just covers the first kind. I think the utilitarians get the first and second, but I wanted to get all three because I think that on reflective equilibrium is what a good distribution would do philosophically.
Right. Okay, so that's like one of the kind of public, or not necessarily
one of the more actually traditional. That was published in the Journal of Bioethical Inquiry, which is a pretty substandard academic peer-reviewed journal, so less public, actually.
Maybe I'm misremembering then, because did you also publish something in the Lancet? Or not the Lancet, was it?
I published in Health Affairs originally, which was a very public-facing piece and was much more politically charged, and I can talk a little bit about that piece. So Health Affairs tends to do pieces at the intersection of public policy and bioethics and law. And something I caught when I was reading the news a couple months ago in July was that the GOP in the US was thinking of cutting Narcan programs. Narcan is a drug that reverses opioid overdoses, and it's been wonderfully helpful in curbing overdose rates in the US. The cuts had to do with all sorts of usual GOP mental gymnastics, that they were too expensive, that
I was curious. I was like,
we're focusing on the wrong things. And that sort of moral argument was what I tried to pick at in that Health Affairs piece. The thinking was that the justification for the budget cut was that, okay, we shouldn't be intervening in overdoses. We should be preventing them outright. We should be treating the source, not the effect. There's some truth to that. There's a real argument to be made that public health initiatives should try at the outset to curve overdoses and things like that, or usage altogether. I get that, and I can understand the intuitive appeal of something like that. I'm less certain of it because of how globalized things like the drug trade are. The US can, adopt all the domestic policy it wants, but without foreign regulation, it's much harder to do that. The argument was then that, intervention matters too. Fine, somebody's using drugs. This is an unfortunate thing. They're suffering from addiction. But that really isn't a basis to leave them high and dry if they overdose. So the argument was that this sort of justification for policy cut or for a budget cut misunderstands the proper aims of public health. Public health is actually also about keeping people healthy even when they're struggling, not just promoting health at this broad level. So that was a much more public-facing piece. It engaged far more directly with actual policy. It engaged with figures like RFK, which I think is probably going to get me in trouble one of these days. Well, I think they definitely flag me at the border now when I try to cross into the States. But yeah, that's just the way you have to do public philosophy. You have to engage with the actual facts of the situation, and you have to be willing to say, this is a real thing that's happening. This affects people's actual lives. And yeah, so that's a much more public facing piece, and it was much more polemic, and it was much more charged.
I'm interested to just hear quickly too about how you approach writing something like that, or just like how I guess two kind of related questions. The first one, I'm just curious, because obviously with like academic articles, they're not usually solicited. It's just stuff that, with some exceptions, you write the article, you submit it to the editor, and then they decide if they want to publish it.
Sure.
And so I assume that like with the first article we chatted about, it was probably something like that.
Yeah, traditional peer review.
So
double blind. It went through the process. It took 6 months.
But for this second one where you're engaging with public figures like RFK and others, was that one solicited? Like did the platform first ask you to write the article, or did you send it to them first, just for people to get a sense of how these things happen?
It's a good question because the processes are very different. So I'll say, I don't know if Health Affairs in particular solicits, but in any case, this article wasn't solicited. It actually came up with just me reading the news about the cut, and I was kind of taken aback by this. And I was talking with some of my colleagues who are not philosophers or even academics, really. They're doctors and lawyers and policy writers. I think I do some work at the Harvard Medical School Center for Bioethics, and that's not a particularly academic institution. It is, obviously, but it also intersects with lots of aims in public policy writing, legislation, and actual clinical care. So, talking with folks like that always gets you a little hot-blooded. And so I wrote out the article. I chatted with some friends and colleagues about it, and it wasn't even meant to be this kind of grand project that I was like, okay, I'm going to look at the lighter report and figure out where this should be published. It was more like, okay, I've written something fairly inflammatory and a little polemic. What kind of spots are going to publish this? And I know that based on the folks I work with there, that Health Affairs is brave. They get some cool stuff out. So it wasn't solicited, but it was submitted for editorial review. The discussion was very different. It was more about okay, you want to say something like this? How are we going to market this? How are we going to make sure it has the impact you want? How are we going to make sure that you're saying things that are a little bit button pushy without tiptoeing into like the domain of libel. So yeah, very different, not blind reviewed, very much more politically charged, very much motivated too by real facts in the world, and things that were going on. Just picking up my phone one day, scrolling through New York Times and seeing, oh wow, they're cutting the Narcan program. This is awful. Yeah. So stylistically, tonally, and I guess substantively quite different projects.
For sure, yeah. So we've heard a little bit about your interests at like the academic level, what you're working on for the dissertation. We just heard a little bit about some public or like more public facing stuff that you're working on. And we have this new philosophy, technology, and public policy lab that's getting created here at McGill. And you and I are both, working as graduate fellows with the research lab. There's a number of things that we have, going on behind the scenes, but I'm just curious to hear your own interest in public policy and how you see your work fitting with the new lab.
Yeah, great. So to answer this question in two parts, like how I see public work and then how that kind of translates to what's going on at PTP. I think the questions I've been working on are kind of almost conceptually public facing. They're questions about what we should do in a public context, right? They're questions about, in fact, what policies should we adopt? What sort of regulations should we have in public theaters? Like I talked about the market a little bit, but other things too. And they're about goods that are relevant to public consumption, like healthcare or income or opportunity. So I think in that way, the transition between those things was always really closely connected. So it just made sense conceptually. That's the theoretical answer. The abstract answer is I quite like policy-oriented writing and things like that. Actually, most recently, I submitted a law review article, which is very different than like a philosophy article. The structure is quite different. You're doing a different thing. The goal is to say, like, here's an issue or a case. Here's what the doctrine actually is, and here's how we should interpret that. And you write that it's tonally different, it's structurally different, and substantively different too. That's also true about the pieces like the one I put out in Health Affairs, where it's like you're writing not so much for a peer reviewer, but you're writing for somebody who might be benefiting from like having Narcan to give their patients. Or somebody who, might be testifying at Congress that, this is a bad idea. And then I think those things too just naturally interest me because I think those are important things to talk about.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear as well. So one thing that I've been thinking about recently, I attended a talk on public policy, and it was by Nancy Cartwright. I was at your alma mater at University of Toronto.
Cool.
And she was talking about two interesting questions having to do with like public policy, and I'm interested to hear some like thoughts that you have about this or how it might relate to what you're working on. So what she was saying that what is interesting for philosophers and public policy people to talk about is, in the first place, how do you measure whether a public policy, like how do you measure in the sort of looking ahead, how do you measure the policy and its effectiveness?
Yeah.
And then in post, once you've implemented it, how do you know that it actually worked? And so I'm interested in hearing, like, do you see those questions intersecting at all with what you're working on? Do you see like, because the issue there was like, how do you implement the policy in a way that you're not confused about whether it's working or not, or precisely why it might be working? So like the examples that were given had to do with, policy decisions about changing people's consumption behavior. And the worry was that, well, we implement this kind of policy change, and it might lead to a measurable change in the population. But how do we know that there's not something else going on there, I guess, is the worry. So I'm interested in hearing, like, does that side the public policy debate or just like connections with philosophy? Is there anything there that is related to what you're working on?
Yeah, wonderful. I'll say at the outset, I'm no public policy analyst. I think my chops are a lot more normative than that. But I think philosophers should still be able to give a principled answer to this question. I think a view that appeals to me is first the idea that, okay, you want to identify the basic goods, so what all citizens kind of have a vested interest in having some of, and you want to make sure those goods are actually like indexable. They need to sort of be measurable, in fact. So we actually do have pretty sophisticated indexes for stuff like this. We have, opportunity-based indexes. We have the happiness index. We have things like the unemployment index.
Yeah.
We also just have like very clear economic metrics for things like the overall share of wealth across the population. So I think effective public policy is going to be one that promotes the goal among those that it aims to promote. And I think the second part is that's measurable based on the indexing of the good across the population. So this might sound quite rudimentary, but a public health policy works if it makes the population healthier.
Right.
That's quite measurable, actually. And the point about confounding variables is harder, actually. It's especially hard in health because we've become increasingly aware of social determinants of health. So things that are not traditionally governed by the domain of healthcare now very obviously contribute to being sick. Being poor makes you sick. Being sort of experiencing hate makes you sick.
Yeah.
Overworking makes you really sick. So I will admit it's difficult to do sort of like a univariable analysis and say like this policy alone, in the absence of any other facts, is giving people a share in the goods. But still, I don't think we should be complete skeptics. I think vaccines make people healthier, for example.
Yeah.
I think they curb infection rates. I think healthier diets tend to make people healthier. And I think eating poorly tends to make people unhealthy. Those things are obviously influenced by things like wealth, access, how walkable your neighborhood is, and what kind of things are in the area. So there's a lot to do. And I guess this is a broader question about how do we fix society? I don't have an answer, but I still have faith that these policies can be measured, they can be effective, and it's okay if they're not, a be-all, end-all explanation of what's going on in a public context. It's okay for them to say, I can say with certainty, this policy is helping on this count, but there's a lot of things going on in the background.
Great. So we've heard a little bit about your, public-facing interests and some stuff that you're working on for the PhD at McGill. Some more theoretical stuff, and we also heard that you're, affiliated with the Harvard Medical School, the Bioethics Center there. Do you want to tell us about anything that you're kind of currently working on that's like in the works? I know you said this. You have the law review article that you're working on. Yeah. Do you have any other papers or projects that are kind of in conceptualization, or you're still working out ideas and getting stuff on the page? What's coming up ahead for you?
So I'll answer this also. I'll point out two projects I'm working on because I also want to answer your previous question about stuff for the PTP Lab. I'll tell you what that project is and what's going on. Again, I am a big fan of places that publish public-facing articles or public-facing essays. Health Affairs was something I've written in, but the APA, the American Philosophical Association, has a wonderful blog. Also at Harvard, the Petrie Flom Center for Biotechnology and Law has a really cool Bill of Health. It's called Bill of Health. It's a wonderful blog. These sort of public-facing things exist. Oxford has the UHero Center, their blog and stuff. And I realized McGill doesn't really have something comparable for the folks working in normative theory.
No,
which is unfortunate because I think it would be wonderful. I think it's sort of pragmatically helpful because these are good these are good map markers. They get McGill scholars' work out there, but it's also more intrinsically valuable just for scholars who work at major research universities to be doing public engagement. So the project I'm working on at PTP is precisely that. It's a sort of public-facing venue to get the fellows to write public-facing articles about the topics they're working on.
Yeah, because I think the closest thing we have to that might be something like the Cray Ethics Forum.
Yeah, that's
like the Center for Research Ethics Forum, but that's more like, they're peer-reviewed articles and it's not quite like the UHero Ethics blog. Good, but I see the idea. That's okay.
The spirit is there at the Cray Ethics Forum, but I do still consider that like a pretty traditional, reputable peer-reviewed journal. I think it's stylistically quite different. I'm thinking here I'd like to get 750 word, 1,000, like
something shorter,
real short, punchy pieces about precisely what the philosophical implications for public questions are. I think giving fellows the opportunity to do that will platform them while also getting their work out there and promote doing work that impacts public discourse. And I think that would be wonderful. So hopefully that's something that's up and running by sometime early next year.
Great.
It's I've worked on editorial projects like this before, and I've always found them very fulfilling, and they've been wonderful. So that's one project that's a little bit distant from traditional academia.
Sure.
On the far other end of the spectrum, funnily enough, despite the kind of talking to you so far about really applied work in practical ethics, political philosophy, and the philosophy of law. I'm working on a paper in metaethics.
Right.
Too.
Oh, yes. Okay.
I have decided to take on a defense of constitutivism.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
To put the point really, or to put the debate really briefly, there's an open question about why moral norms have any authority. Why are they not like the other norms, which are conditionally binding?
Sure.
The norms of morality and practical reason categorically binding.
Yeah.
I think constitutivism gives quite a good answer. It basically says that norms are derived from something about agency. So think about it like this. Luca Ferrero is a philosopher, and he gives this example. Just as it is to sort of be a chess player, is to be governed by the norms of chess. Same as to be an agent. You know, in the same way I can't move my rooks diagonally, or I sort of systematically lose my claim to being a chess player. So too can I not violate the norms of morality without kind of a loss of agency. But constitutivists seem to be confident you must be an agent. There isn't a choice. I can opt out of playing chess anytime I like, so to hell with the norms of chess.
Yeah.
I'm always an agent, so I can't so much opt out of the norms of morality in that way if the constitutivist story goes the way it goes. Of course, this has come under heavy fire because it's quite an ambitious claim. It promises quite a lot, and whether it delivers on that, it's up for debate. David Enoch, a wonderful philosopher, I think at NYU or Oxford, one of the two, has argued that a lot of us can just choose to be smagents. Actually, it's just like chess. What if I don't care about being an agent? What if I have no real interest in undertaking agency or acting in the same way? It's a powerful objection because it then says, well, then the norms have no authority. They're conditional in the same way the norms of chess or playing soccer or video games are. I think David Enoch's objection is quite powerful, but I think it turns on a conception of agency that's much too individualistic. I think of agency as very relational. Maybe this is me bringing in political philosophy biases into metaethics and things like that. But I think of agency as just a sort of way of mediating claims we have over one another. You tell me that you're going to meet me at 2:30 so we can take the metro up to film this podcast, and you don't. Well, it seems like you've kind of violated some tacit agreement we had. Or if I tell you that, okay, Alex, I'm going to be at your talk, and I don't show up, it seems like you have a claim to say, well, you kind of forfeited on some agreement we had. I think that's very relational. And I don't think you can opt out of that. And I think the enterprise is normatively significant because we're just evaluating when the claims you have over me and I have over you are legitimate. So I think that, I hope, gets us out of Enoch's challenge. It means that, in fact, you must be an agent, but not just that, you also have good reasons to be one. I don't have good reasons to play chess unless I like chess. But morality seems to be normatively authoritative, not inert. So that's one project that's very in the works. I'm all over the place. It's going over my head. I'm out of my depth. But there's wonderful meta-ethicists at McGill, so I'm in good hands, I think, with assistance for this project. Yeah, that's another one.
And that kind of marks the difference, I think, between grad school and undergrad is you're allowed to kind of move out of your depth a little bit, work on topics you might not get the freedom to in undergrad. But yeah, it's been great chatting with you, and I think we'll wrap it up here.
Great.
So I've been chatting with Radheesh, and he's, again, a PhD candidate here at McGill, and he's also working at Harvard with the medical school there and their Center for Bioethics. So thanks again. This has been the McGill Philosophy Department Podcast, and we'll see you next time.